In this exciting episode of the Perry Pod, Della's wearing striped gloves to go along with her striped sweater. A foreshadowing of her wearing stripes in Alcatraz when she gets caught fiddling with a deceased woman's mail. It's Season 1, Episode 30 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Screaming Woman. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies, too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia, as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each week in the Law Library, we return to prior episodes to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. This week, we talk about the only part of federal law everyone in the show seems to know about. Namely, that you can't tamper with the mail. Yep, it comes up in this particular episode.
That is a lot of ifs. And the last time I heard, Uncle Sam takes a very dim view of tampering with the mail.
It came up in the case of the daring decoy, too.
It's against the law. Tampering with the mails, you know.
In the case of the lonely heiress, Natch.
After all, I got a license to protect, and the postal authorities are involved in this, and I have no desire to tangle with those boys.
California is one of the few states in the Union that has specific laws on the books dealing with mail tampering. It's a misdemeanor that will get you a year in prison and a $1,000 fine if you're caught taking, vandalizing, or even looking harshly at someone else's mail. Well, not that last one, but you know what I mean. If the case goes federal, you can get 5 years in the penitentiary as well as a $250,000 fine. That's no joke. Now, without further ado, let's get to the plot of this episode. The Case of the Screaming Woman. This case features the first season's most loathed murder victims, and consequently one of its most sympathy-inducing murderers. Mary Kay Davis, no apparent connection to the makeup baroness, writes columns that name names. She keeps a shyster lawyer on retainer to deal with the inevitable charges of libel. Plus, she's married to someone in the State Department.
I can give a child everything. Money, position. You know who my husband is?
I know. He's Ralph Davis of the State Department.
A pulpit, legal support, a powerful husband. What more could a woman want? Well, pretty much everything. It seems her husband is stepping out on her.
My husband wants a divorce. Right now he thinks I'm carrying his child. That's the only thing that's stopping him.
It also seems she's lied to get him back.
Now my husband thinks I'm going to have a child. His child. So do thousands of other people throughout the country. I've told them all about it in my newspaper column.
Now she needs a kid, and she stoops to robbery and blackmail to get one.
I have something you want. A book. And you have something I want, a baby. I suggest we trade.
Enter Philip Barnes, an MD with a messiah complex who thinks he can fix adoption in California one unwed mother at a time.
The whole idea is insane.
Well, it may be insane, Mr. Mason, but it worked. And it's been working for many years.
How much did Dr. Barnes charge for these services?
Not a penny. He just wanted to make sure that these unfortunate children would have a chance in life. He's a great man, Mr. Mason.
Mary Kay Davis steals the book containing Barnes's records thanks to info she got from her secretary, Connie Cooper. It seems Miss Cooper knows about the book because of her fiancé, Bob Schroeder.
It's all my fault, Mr. Mason. You have to believe that. If it weren't for me, Mary Kay wouldn't have known anything about the book or the doctor. Oh, like a fool, I told her everything.
A professor at Brownell Junior College. Note, there is no actual Brownell Junior College. Barnes's nurse, Leona Walsh, consults Perry, hoping that our intrepid hero can get that book back.
I went to her apartment. It isn't there. Well, can you think of anything better?
Then Mary Kay ends up dead, and things get complicated when Leona Walsh admits committing the crime.
I came to give myself up. I killed Mary Kay Davis.
After stealing the book, Mary Kay sent it to herself, and Perry has the bright idea of having Della rent Mary Kay's now vacant apartment so that she can nab it before the prosecution.
When the letter gets here, don't open it. Just put it in with Mary Kay's things. And don't tell the mailman that you're Mrs. Gunther. Now, I'll be outside in the car. 2 honks on the horn means the trag's on his way. So just leave without the letter.
Mr. Drake, haven't you forgotten something?
Huh? What?
How do I signal you?
Well, if anything goes wrong, you can just throw your shoes out the window.
Believe me, if anything goes wrong, I'll be wearing them.
Della succeeds, but that creates another problem. Now she's in possession of stolen property filled with high-powered names who really don't want the info in the book released to the public. Arthur Jarrick, Mary Kay's attorney, knows about the book and wants it for, shall we say, less than honorable reasons.
That book contains some very influential names.
Names you propose to blackmail?
No, not blackmail. Why, some of the names in that book spend thousands a year for legal work. All they have to do is to give us that work. Then we can get out of this slimy rat race of criminal law.
Berger puts Della on the stand to not only get the book, he maintains it was the motive for murder, but also to get at Perry. He's sure Della's testimony will send the entire Perry entourage to jail. Della becomes a student to Berger's teacher, answering each of the examination's first few questions with clipped answers.
Miss Street, you're employed by Perry Mason as a confidential secretary?
Yes, sir.
Were you ever in a furnished apartment at 1427 Crane Avenue? An apartment occupied by Mary Kay Davis, alias Mary Kay Gunther.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mason took you there?
No, sir.
Well, Mr. Mason sent you there.
Yes, sir.
But once Berger gets even close to what he wants, Perry unleashes a flurry of objections.
Objection, Your Honor. Miss Street might well have taken 2, 3, even 10 such deliveries. Would the district attorney be more specific? Objection, Your Honor. That question is incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial, unless the district attorney first discloses what was in such an envelope and that it has a bearing on this case. Objected to on the grounds that the question calls for hearsay testimony, that it calls for a conclusion of the witness, that it is not the best evidence, and furthermore, it is incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial. Objected to as assuming facts not in evidence. The court has already ruled that any evidence as to anything Miss Street might have received on the day in question is incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial, unless the prosecutor first has connected it with this case. Objected to on the ground that it calls for a conclusion from the witness. The defendant in this case is not bound by what Miss Street may have thought she was receiving or what Miss Street thought might have been evidence.
Berger is spouting metaphorical blood, and he gets no relief from the judge, who with each sustained ruling squirts lemon juice in Berger's wound.
Objection sustained.
Your Honor, Mr. Mason is grabbing at straws.
The court has ruled, Mr. Berger. The objection is based on technical grounds. Nevertheless, the objection is well taken. Sustained. Mr. Prosecutor, the court is going to sustain the objection.
The court would then realize that I have to fight it out on this line if it takes all day.
Well, that is your privilege, Mr. District Attorney. The court has the afternoon available.
Unable to get the information he wants, Berger has to let Della go and grudgingly asks the judge for a continuance, and the judge grants it, but takes the opportunity to skewer Berger. Perry can barely keep from laughing.
Mr. Berger, the court realizes that these objections have been highly technical and that the rulings of the court have been technical. But technicalities exist for the express purpose of protecting the legal rights of persons charged with crimes. The only difference between a technical and a constitutional safeguard is one of degree, and that degree may exist solely in the mind of the prosecutor.
After getting Dr. Barnes to torch the record book, note to you legal eagles, you can't turn over what no longer exists. Perry goes back to Mary Kay's hotel, finds a dictation machine, and pulls out the famous legal pyrotechnics for which he is known.
Paul, I want to find an actress who can do voice impersonations.
Well, I know an actor's agent, if I can wake him up.
Well, wake him up. I want to see that actress in my office first thing in the morning.
These fireworks, this time, get pulled off with a heavy dose of reverse psychology.
Mr. Berger obviously has no idea what is recorded on that cylinder. Mr. Berger, I assure you, it's irrelevant, incompetent, and immaterial.
Then why are you afraid for us to hear it?
Berger plays a rigged dictation tape in court that makes it seem like Mary Kay was going to reveal something she learned from Dr. Barnes's book, and this elicits the long-awaited titular scream of the murderer, Miss Connie Cooper.
Some people may say that I am needlessly hurting an innocent person by this story. That as a result, a life may be ruined.
I killed her, but don't play it!
In the denouement, we learn that Hamilton Berger needs to work on his aim.
I wanted to help him, Trag. I tried to point out that it was irrelevant, incompetent, and immaterial. You might tell him that.
Yes, I already have. That's how this got broken. You know, he never should get mad. Why, he missed me by at least 2 feet.
My, happy days are here again. Now, let's discuss the 1957 novel that the episode was based on. And yep, there are some significant differences. Number 1, yes, there's a baby farm being run by a doctor named Dr. Babb. Yes, he kept records. And yes, no one wants those records released. But that's it for the differences. Number 2, our murder victim is the good doctor himself. Number 3, the defendant, not a woman, but an oil man named John Kirby, whose son was adopted through the work of Dr. Babb. Number 4, who is the murderer? Not a woman, but Dr. Babb's handyman, Don Derby, who is nowhere to be seen in the show. Number 5, we've got no Mary Kay Davis, no husband in the State Department, no Connie Cooper. We have a likable victim and a despicable murderer, the exact opposite of the show. Number 6, we do have 2 fire sequences from the show. Gardner gave us the showdown between Perry and a slick defense attorney, complete with the line about rats. And we get Della on the stand, complete with all the objections and the judge's admonition to the prosecutor. So that's great. Number 7, what's odd to me is that Gardner wrote this novel in 57 after the show had started, and yet, given the fact that he wrote this probably to be adapted, the teleplay writers, Dick Stenger and Gene Wang, still had to implement some serious plot overhaul. Why is that? I will give Gardner this. He did give us a screaming woman in the novel at the scene of the crime. The best Stenger and Wang could do is give us a screaming woman as she's giving the confession. Something that, of course, never really happens in the novels. It did my heart good to see the best scenes from this particular episode in the novel, though. Way to go, Earl Stanley. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more, a Della is something about a particular character in the story, and a Perry is something we learn about our main character. Our Paul this week concerns the kind of baby smuggling operation that Dr. Barnes is operating. Gardner obviously thought that the topic was current enough to write about it, not in 1938, but in the year of our Lord, 1957. So this week's research prompt is this. Was this story actually topical? Was Gardner pulling a story from the headlines? If so, how was the real-life Barnes found out? Were there a rash of blackmail cases involving adoptions in the late 1950s? Our Della this week concerns the actress who portrayed Mary Kay Davis, Marion Seldes.
There's no use appealing to my better nature, Miss Walsh. I don't have one.
Seldes is perhaps the most decorated actress ever to be a murder victim in this first season of Mason. In 1967, she won a Tony for her performance in the play A Delicate Balance. In 2010, she received a Lifetime Award from the Tonys, and she taught acting at Juilliard. When the New York Public Library's Performing Arts Wing put together a film on the profession of acting, they interviewed her. You can actually find that one on YouTube. There is a disturbing overlap between Mary Kay and Marion. Mary Kay says this line early in the episode.
You'll pardon me for seeming melodramatic, but I have a great horror of being manhandled.
Now, Seldes' first marriage was to producer Julian Clayman, who was best known for his series Have Gun Will Travel. Clayman was an abusive husband. Marion Seldes actually was manhandled, and she got a divorce from Clayman in 1961. Seldes died in 2014 at the age of 84. Our Perry this episode concerns Perry's brief, flirty triangle with Paul's actress operative. Sure, Perry made eyes at Sherry Chi-Chi in the case of the fan dancer's horse, but that was a grateful client. Paul's operative may be a little bit too close to home for someone else's taste.
Well, that was a fine performance, Miss Clay. Paul, will you see that Miss Clay gets home? With pleasure.
Bye, Mr. Mason.
Goodbye.
If ever there's anything else I can do for you.
Well, I think that...
We'll call you.
Yep, Della put the kibosh on those eyes, lickety-split. Our theme for this episode is outside the law. Look at Perry's opponents in the case, the people he reserves his harshest reprimands for, Arthur Jarrick and George Barnes. While these men have separate intentions, they both aim to work outside the law. Jarrick doesn't like the law. He likes money. And when he sees a chance to use blackmail to line his own pockets, he can hardly contain his excitement. George Barnes thinks he's above the law. Leona Walsh calls him a great man. And I'm sure Barnes thinks that's true. But when we find that he's not all that kind of Leona, that he thinks she committed the murder, that she should have left it for him to do, it turns out that Mr. Save the World actually just thinks none of the rules apply to him, and Perry's got no time for that. And then, what of our legal pyrotechnic master himself? Frankly, it's odd to see Perry as the stalwart for the rule of law. This is the episode where he presses on the law's letter to get Della and himself out of hot water. Typically, the letter of the law is his opponent. He's opting to obey the law's spirit in order to get his clients off. But this time, his knowledge of the law saves him. His reverse psychology with Tragg and Berger actually causes them to look for legal loopholes to try and trap Leona Walsh. He's the law-abiding citizen. They're the ones eager to throw out the rules to get a conviction. It's telling that Berger throws the dictation canisters at Tragg. Typically, Berger is threatening to throw the book, presumably a legal one, at Perry and the gang. And this episode shows he needs to hold on to it and perhaps consult it. Perry knows that book's contents far better than his opponent, no matter what his reputation for legal razzle-dazzle might be. Now, it's time for a Perry proverb. Arthur Jarrick badmouths not just criminal law, but thanks to his rat race reference, the lawyers who practice it. Are you through, Jarrick? Well, then allow Mr. Mason to retort.
The practice of criminal law isn't slimy unless you make it that way. And it isn't a rat race unless you run with rats.
Here's how Mason delivers this same speech in Gardner's novel. The practice of criminal law isn't slimy unless you make it slimy. It isn't a rat race unless you run with rats. The law gives every person accused of crime an opportunity to be confronted with the witnesses against him, the chance to cross-examine those witnesses, to present his case to a jury. The law clothes him with constitutional rights and safeguards against wrongful conviction. Then, the Jarrett character in the book cuts him off. And that's fitting too. This kind of proverb is best kept short and sweet. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Thanks to everyone who responded to the previous episode. I heard from podcast listener Dennis, who provided his theory for why so many people are falsely charged with murder in Perry's Los Angeles. There are obviously other cases we haven't seen, Dennis argues. And, quote, I think Perry and Berger have met a number of times, and Perry has won the lion's share of cases, not by getting courtroom confessions, but by using legal loopholes to get evidence excluded or impeach witnesses. Courtroom theatrics put doubt in the jury's minds, and Berger and Tragg probably think Perry has gotten a lot of guilty people off, end quote. I'm intrigued by Dennis's theory, and it makes me wonder whether someone out there in Perry's legions of fans has actually started writing as fan fiction some of these lost cases. If you've written Perry fan fiction or know of someone who does it well, please let me know. And thanks for the note, Dennis. Our poll last week concerned heroin. Yes, Joe Gibbs calls it snow, but we would have also accepted the nickname smack or junk. Most heroin is derived from opium growth in Southeast Asia or Latin America. It sounds like Perry's LA snow came from Latin America, the other LA. In the 1950s, heroin was predominantly associated with the counterculture. See, for instance, the Frank Sinatra vehicle, The Man with the Golden Arm, 1955, which showed the drug's tragic allure and harmful consequences. According to a report on drug enforcement costs, quote, the typical adult heroin offender in 1960s California was a male heroin addict of Mexican descent from Los Angeles. He was 25 years of age or older and had a lengthy criminal record for drugs and crimes against property. 7 out of 10 heroin offenders had already served prison or jail sentences at the time of their 1960 arrest. Close quote. California convicted more people for heroin in 1960 than marijuana. Side note, we last saw a Mexican character in the case of the fan dancer's horse. When will we see another? We certainly didn't see this kind of customer in the case of the hesitant hostess. While I wasn't able to track down particular laws about heroin sentencing, I did find that there was a key U.S. court case involving heroin in 1959, Draper versus the U.S. In this case, a federal agent arrested a man for heroin possession and drug trafficking without a warrant based solely on the information of a paid informant. The court upheld the case, deciding that the informant's information constituted probable cause. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on? Something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All Perry Pod episodes are now available via Spotify and YouTube as well as iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next time, Perry makes the big bucks, and shocker, his case involves an unhappy marriage and a lascivious nurse. It's the case of the fiery fingers. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!